It started with a dare, the kind that makes your stomach tighten even before you agree to it. Late one autumn evening, four of us, my cousin Aaron, my friend Mia, my younger brother Tyler, and me, stood at the edge of an overgrown lot at the far end of town. Looming before us was the Holloway house, an abandoned two-story structure that had been empty for decades. Its windows were boarded, the roof sagged like a broken spine, and the front porch tilted to one side as though it were trying to shake off visitors. Nobody lived there, not since the Holloway family vanished one night in 1987, leaving behind half-eaten dinners and a dog tied in the backyard that had starved. People said the place had been cursed ever since, but that was the kind of story kids repeated without really believing. Still, I felt uneasy as I stared at it. The house wasn't just empty. It seemed watchful, like it had a memory of who'd walked inside and who never came back out. The air around it smelled faintly of mildew and copper, damp but metallic, almost like blood. The lot was surrounded by tall grass and twisted trees, their branches black silhouettes against a dull gray sky. The house seemed to breathe with the shifting wind, creaks and groans echoing from within, though no one had stepped inside yet. I glanced at Aaron, who smirked and shoved me forward. "You first," he said. Inside, the air was colder, almost unnaturally so, as if the house had trapped decades of winter in its walls. Our flashlights cut thin beams through the darkness, landing on peeling wallpaper, broken picture frames, and furniture draped in moldy sheets. Dust floated like ash in the stillness, disturbed by every cautious step. Tyler whispered that he thought he saw something move near the staircase, but when we aimed our lights, there was nothing, just a railing split down the middle and shadows that clung too tightly to the corners. We laughed nervously, the sound bouncing hollow against the empty rooms, but it was the kind of laughter that cracked easily into silence that we moved deeper, passing through what must have been the dining room. A long wooden table, warped and buckled, still held a rusted candelabra. Plates and silverware were scattered across the floor, as if someone had dropped them mid-meal. One plate still had a hardened crust of food on it, decades old, but disturbingly intact. Mia bent closer, shining her light, and swore she saw a fresh bite taken out of it, as if someone had just eaten there. Aaron barked a laugh, claiming it was just rot, but none of us wanted to look too long. Something about the house felt frozen in time, not decayed the way it should have been after 35 years. That's when we heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps upstairs. Slow, heavy, deliberate. Each one pressed into the silence until it filled the room. We all froze, eyes darting upward toward the ceiling. Aaron's bravado slipped for a second, though he forced a grin and whispered, "Probably just raccoons." But we knew better. These weren't scurrying, scratching noises. These were human steps. They paused directly above us, in the very center of the ceiling, like whoever, or whatever, was up there knew exactly where we stood. The air felt like it collapsed in on itself, the silence after each step louder than the creaks themselves. Tyler's hand gripped mine so tightly his nails dug into my skin. And for the first time, I wished we had never come here. The next morning, the ocean majesty felt quieter. Conversations in the dining room were hushed, eyes darting toward the windows that overlooked the water. The official announcement about the missing passenger was clinical and rehearsed. Despite an extensive search, Ms. Laura Bennett has not been located. Our thoughts are with her loved ones during this difficult time. No mention of how she'd gone overboard. No details, no explanations. Megan's table mates exchanged uneasy glances before changing the subject entirely, as though speaking of it too long might invite the same fate. Megan decided she couldn't let it go. She went down to guest services again, demanding to speak to the ship's security officer. The receptionist, the same young man as before, tried to placate her with polite deflections, but this time she refused to leave. After several tense minutes, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a crisp white uniform appeared. His name tag read Chief Security Officer Markham. He led her into a small, windowless office and shut the door. "You should drop this," he said immediately. His tone wasn't threatening. It was weary, almost resigned. When Megan asked why, he sighed and leaned in. "You've seen him, haven't you? The man in the suit." Markham's expression didn't change when she nodded. "He's been on this ship longer than anyone can prove. We've checked manifests going back 15 years. Every time a passenger in a certain section of Deck 7 vanishes, there are reports of him. Always the same description. Always near the victim's cabin. And it's never random. Megan felt her mouth go dry. Then why not lock that section? Warn people. Markham looked away. Orders from above. And sometimes the disappearances stop for months. We don't want panic. His voice dropped even lower. But the moment he starts watching someone, it's already too late. Before she could press him for more, a sharp knock rattled the office door. Another officer stepped in, whispering something into Markham's ear. His face drained of color. "Stay in your cabin tonight," he told Megan urgently. "Lock the door. Don't answer for anyone." He hesitated, then added, "If you hear the knock, it means he's already chosen you." Back in her cabin, Megan locked the door, shoved a chair under the handle, and sat on the bed with every light on. Hours passed. The ship groaned and shifted under the weight of the sea. Just as she started to think she might make it through the night, she heard it. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Exactly like before. But this time, the voice that followed wasn't the man's deep monotone. It was her own voice, perfect in tone and pitch, calling softly, "Megan, let me in." The following morning was unusually bright for the season, the sky a pale gold that seemed to soften the chill in the air. Evelyn rose early, unable to shake the innkeeper's words from the night before. Sometimes the past, sometimes the future. She'd lain awake, turning them over. The image of her smiling reflection lodged in her mind like a pebble in her shoe. By the time she came downstairs, the innkeeper was already busy slicing apples for what smelled like a pie. He greeted her with his usual calm warmth, but didn't mention the river, and she didn't ask, not yet. Instead, she walked back to the bend she'd visited the day before. The path was still damp from an early frost, and the grass sparkled faintly in the sunlight. The water at the bend was as still as she remembered, the surface flawless. Evelyn hesitated, then crouched at the edge and reached out her hand until her fingertips brushed the cold surface. She expected ripples to fan out in ordinary rings, but instead, the water seemed to pull inward, the movement converging toward a single point. From that point, an image began to form, blurry at first, then sharpening into something unmistakable. It was the inn's main room, exactly as it had been the night before. The fire, the bookshelves, the kettle hissing on the hearth. But there was something else, someone else. In the vision, a man she didn't recognize was standing at the counter, speaking with the innkeeper in a low voice. The man's coat was long and dark, and though his face was turned slightly away, she caught the sharp line of his jaw, the pale of his skin. She strained to hear, but the image rippled and dissolved before she could catch the words. She sat back on her heels, her heart quickening. The man hadn't been in the inn when she'd arrived in the village. Of that she was certain. Was this the past, the future, or something entirely different? She glanced around, half expecting someone to be watching, but the riverbank was empty save for a few birds pecking at the damp earth. The only sound was the steady movement of the current beyond the bend. When she returned to the inn, the innkeeper looked up from the counter, where he was polishing a row of mismatched cups. His gaze lingered on her a moment longer than usual, as though he knew exactly where she'd been. "You went to the bend," he said, not a question. She opened her mouth to respond, but he added quietly, "When the river shows you someone, it's because your path will cross theirs." Evelyn swallowed, unsure if she felt more curious or uneasy. In her mind, she saw again the man's pale face and dark coat, and wondered just how soon their paths would meet. At dawn, Claire made up her mind to leave. No notebook, no final draft, no story was worth this. The jars were bad enough, but the feeling of being tracked, followed, documented, was unbearable. She packed her belongings in record time, avoiding the window as much as possible. The forest outside was wet from dew, each branch dripping like the woods had been sweating. The air carried a strange metallic taste, the same one that clung to the jars. She started her car, the sound breaking the morning quiet, and felt relief as the gravel crunched beneath her tires. For the first mile, the road looked normal. The trees swayed gently, sunlight breaking through in silver spears. But then the path curved in a way it hadn't before, leading deeper into the forest instead of out toward the highway. Claire frowned, slowing the car. She checked the GPS. It showed a straight route north, but the screen glitched, the signal blinking in and out. After several turns, she realized the road had looped back on itself. Ahead of her, through the windshield, sat her own cabin. Its porch, her luggage tracks, and the 3 jars still lined up like sentinels. Panic surged through her chest. She backed up, spun the wheel, and tried again, taking a different dirt path she swore hadn't been there yesterday. The trees grew denser, their branches intertwining overhead like a tunnel. After 10 minutes, the forest light dimmed unnaturally, as though dusk had arrived early. Then, something flashed between the trunks, a lantern's glow. It drifted alongside her, always keeping pace no matter how fast she drove. The road beneath her tires began to change, the gravel turning to slick mud. The engine sputtered, and the car died. Claire sat frozen, gripping the steering wheel. Outside, the lantern glow stopped moving. It hovered maybe 20 feet away, behind a veil of thin mist. Then she saw it, the outline of a man, just visible through the fog. Tall, shoulders slumped, his head bent slightly as if studying her. When she blinked, he was gone, but the lantern light remained. The woods were silent except for the soft, rhythmic drip of water from the branches above. Then she heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the car. Gravel crunched, one careful step at a time. She slammed the door lock and whispered to herself, "This isn't real. It's not real." Her breath came fast and shallow. But then she noticed something. On the passenger seat lay a mason jar she hadn't brought. Inside floated a torn page from her own notebook, the one she'd left on the desk in the cabin. The words, written in her own handwriting, read, "The forest keeps what it's given." She screamed, threw open the door, and ran back toward the road. The trees seemed to twist as she passed, guiding her, no, hurting her, back toward the cabin. By the time she stumbled out into the clearing, gasping and covered in mud, the jars were no longer 3. There were now 4. By the time Clara returned to the inn, twilight had folded itself over the valley. The golden grasses swayed like a sea of shadows, and lanterns along the dirt road had begun to glow softly, as though lit by unseen hands. She walked slowly, her steps unhurried, feeling the lingering hum of the forest still vibrating faintly within her chest. When she reached the lantern's rest, the inn looked different than it had that morning. Not merely warm and welcoming, but alive, as if the house itself had been holding its breath while she was away. Inside, the hearth still burned, and the scent of herbs and roasted vegetables drifted from the kitchen. The innkeeper greeted her with the same serene smile, though this time, her eyes seemed sharper, more curious. "You found the path," she said simply, as though it had been inevitable. Clara felt no urge to deny it. She only nodded, her voice quiet when she asked, "The stone, what is it?" The innkeeper paused for a long moment before replying. "It has been waiting a long time. And so have you." The words were spoken gently, but they rooted themselves deeply in Clara's thoughts. Later, as night deepened, Clara sat again by the fire with a book she had plucked from the shelves. She tried to focus on the pages, but her eyes drifted off into the flames, where shadows leapt and curled in patterns that almost looked intentional. At one point, she thought she heard her name spoken, not aloud but in her mind, carried on the crackle of the fire. She turned sharply, but the innkeeper was not in the room. The silence settled again, wrapping around her like a heavy quilt. Clara set the book aside and closed her eyes, letting the warmth lull her, until the faint impression of watchers, gentle, patient, unseen, rose in her thoughts. That night, her sleep was filled with dreams. She walked the forest path again, but this time the trees glowed faintly with light, their trunks shimmering as though stitched with silver threads. The pale stone stood at the clearing's center, brighter than before, and around it gathered figures made of shadow and starlight. They did not speak, yet their presence felt neither threatening nor unfamiliar. Clara felt a strange recognition, as though she had stood among them once, long ago. When she reached toward them, the dream shifted into silence, and she awoke with her heart both calm and racing. The room was still dark, moonlight spilling across the quilt. For a moment, She thought she heard that same whisper again, softer than a breath, threaded through the walls of the inn. She didn't try to chase the meaning of it. Instead, she closed her eyes once more, letting herself drift back into rest. But as she did, one thought lingered. She had not imagined the Watchers. Whether dream or memory, they were there. And tomorrow, she would return to the forest to find them again. Claire didn't sleep. She couldn't. The words from the jar, "The fifth night belongs to him," kept circling her mind, looping like a chant. She checked the clock obsessively, watching the seconds drag toward midnight. The cabin felt wrong, like the air had thickened. The shadows clung to corners, stretching longer than they should. She tried calling the property manager again, but the line only hissed with static. Even the forest outside was utterly still, as if waiting. Every few minutes, she thought she heard the faint slosh of water, like someone dragging a heavy bucket across the porch. When the clock struck 12, the lantern light appeared again, this time not at the lake, but at the tree line behind the cabin. It swayed, closer, each flicker revealing a flash of wet fabric, the edge of a boot, the faint outline of a face. Claire clenched the brass key in her hand, the one she'd found inside the jar. Her instincts screamed to run, but a deeper, colder part of her knew that running hadn't worked before. She stepped outside, the air cold enough to sting her lungs. The forest exhaled a damp fog, and with it came the smell of decay and rust. She followed the lantern's light down the narrow path toward the lake. The glow drifted ahead, just far enough to stay out of reach. At the water's edge, the figure finally stopped. Elias Vane, or what was left of him, stood knee-deep in the black water. His skin looked pale as candle wax, his hair slicked to his face, and his eyes, where they should have been, were hollow pits that caught the lantern's glow from within. He raised a jar in one hand, just like the ones left on her porch. Inside, something faintly shimmered, a pulse of light, like a trapped breath. "You took what was mine," his voice rasped, a sound like water spilling over stones. "Your story, your nights." Claire backed away, shaking her head. "I didn't take anything. You left them for me." He tilted his head, water dripping from his chin. "I leave what I keep. You wrote of the dead, but you forgot to ask permission." His tone softened, almost tender. "Now I write you." Before she could move, he extended the jar toward her. The lid twisted open by itself with a soft click, and a stream of mist flowed from it, curling around her like smoke. The world blurred. The trees, the lake, the stars above. And suddenly she wasn't standing anymore but floating, her heartbeat muffled, her breath shallow. In that gray blur, she saw flashes of the past, faces of others who'd stayed here, eyes wide with the same fear, each trapped in their own glass prisons. Elias' voice echoed faintly. Every story must be preserved. Then darkness. When she awoke, she was back inside the cabin, sitting at her desk. Her typewriter sat before her, a half-finished page still in the roller. The words weren't hers, but they were typed in her style, calm, methodical, almost professional. The fifth night ends with silence. The story continues without her. Outside, dawn was breaking. On the porch, the jars now numbered 5, all perfectly aligned. The fifth jar held a Polaroid taken from inside the cabin, her sitting at the desk, typing, eyes vacant and unfocused. A month passed before anyone else rented the cabin. The property listing had quietly resurfaced online, the description unchanged. A secluded writer's retreat, private lake access, no neighbors for miles. There was no mention of Claire Warren, the journalist who'd vanished without a trace. When Aaron Duval arrived, he was looking for silence, too. An escape from the noise of his failing marriage and the deadline he'd already missed twice. The cabin was perfect for that. Tucked into the pines, still, serene. The air smelled faintly of moss and wood smoke. He noticed the faint outline of tire tracks in the mud as he parked, already half-faded by rain. Inside, everything looked freshly cleaned, though in a strange, unnatural way, like a hotel room no one had stayed in for years. The furniture was dustless, the floor swept, but the walls carried faint stains, as if someone had recently scrubbed them hard. A typewriter sat on the table, an old Olivetti with one sheet still rolled inside. Aaron smiled. He loved old things like that. But when he read the unfinished page, his brow furrowed. The words were oddly precise, detached, written in a journalistic tone. The fifth night ends with silence. The story continues without her. No name, no signature, just that. That night, rain fell hard against the windows. Aaron wrote for hours, the rhythm of the typewriter easing his nerves. Around midnight, he heard it, the faint crunch of gravel outside. He froze, hands poised above the keys. Probably an animal, he told himself. But when he glanced toward the window, a flash of light caught his eye, a lantern's flicker reflecting off the lake. He stood, peering through the rain-streaked glass. Nothing but the dark forest beyond the clearing. When he turned back, something new was sitting on the desk beside him, a mason jar filled halfway with murky water. He hadn't brought it there. Inside the jar floated a small Polaroid, the film still fresh. He lifted it, expecting to see the lake or the cabin exterior, maybe even some prank from a previous guest. Instead, his stomach dropped. The photograph showed him, seated at the desk just seconds ago, looking out the window. The rain hadn't even stopped in the picture. He stared at it, pulse hammering. Then he noticed the handwriting on the back. 6. No explanation. No name. Just that number. Sleep was impossible after that. Aaron sat on the couch, listening to the storm fade into silence. Sometime near dawn, a sound came from the typewriter, the clack-clack-clack of keys pressing themselves. He approached slowly. On the fresh page, a single sentence appeared. The next one always comes looking for quiet. Aaron's hands trembled as he read it. He turned toward the door, ready to leave right then, but paused. Through the window, the rain had stopped, and in the distance by the water, he saw it again. A lantern's glow drifting slowly along the shoreline, moving closer. The next morning, Megan convinced herself she'd overreacted. Cruises had security cameras, trained staff, and plenty of people around. Surely she wasn't in any real danger. Still, as she made her way to the breakfast buffet, she couldn't shake the memory of the slow, deliberate knock on her door. The corridor outside her cabin seemed longer than usual, lined with identical doors that gave no hint of the people behind them. 2 uniformed crew members passed her, speaking softly in a language she didn't recognize. As they walked by, she noticed one of them glancing over his shoulder at her. Not just a quick glance, but a long, assessing look, as though measuring her reaction. Breakfast should have been a comfort. Sunlight pouring through panoramic windows, the clatter of plates, the smell of coffee and fresh pastries. But Megan's attention kept snagging on small details. A waiter refilling water glasses seemed to be lingering at her table just a beat too long. A young couple at the next table whispered rapidly to each other and kept glancing toward the entrance. And when she finally stood to leave, she caught sight of the man from the night before, the one in the dark suit, seated alone near the back. His hands were folded neatly on the table, his plate untouched. He didn't blink when their eyes met. This time, Megan didn't wait to see if he would vanish. She turned and left. She decided to spend the afternoon exploring the ship. Deck 7 had several quiet lounges and a library that smelled faintly of old paper despite the ocean air. In the library, she struck up a brief conversation with an older British woman named Helen, who was knitting in the corner. When Megan mentioned seeing a man in a dark suit, Helen's needles paused mid-click. Tall, thin, doesn't eat? Helen asked, her voice low. I've seen him too. 3 years ago, on this very ship. Different cruise. He was watching people then as well. Before Megan could ask more, another passenger entered, and Helen's demeanor instantly brightened, as if she hadn't said anything at all. That evening, Megan noticed a change in the ship's atmosphere. The wind picked up, rattling the glass doors on the outer decks. The hallways seemed dimmer, shadows stretching farther than they should. She passed a security camera mounted above the stairwell and had the sudden, irrational feeling that it wasn't connected to anything at all. Back in her cabin, she locked the door and tried to distract herself with a movie on the tiny wall-mounted TV. Halfway through, the screen flickered, briefly showing what looked like live footage of the ship's exterior decks at night. In the grainy image, a lone figure stood at the railing, unmoving, staring out at the sea. She shut off the TV, her heart pounding. The ship's engines throbbed beneath her feet, steady and relentless, but she couldn't shake the growing sense that the ocean majesty wasn't just carrying her across the Caribbean. It was carrying something else, something that didn't belong among the living. The whispers didn't stop. Even after the morning light should have broken them apart, they lingered, low, steady, rhythmic. Aaron sat on the floor, surrounded by Claire's damp notes, every word vibrating in his head. He's in the reflection. It repeated like a curse. He hadn't meant to believe any of it, but denial had become impossible. The jars, the photos, the typewriter, all of it had a will of its own. Finally, as dusk began to crawl across the windows, he made a decision. If the lake held the truth, he would find it. Armed with a flashlight, his camera, and the brass key marked 5, Aaron stepped outside. The forest had gone utterly silent again. No wind, no insects, not even the creak of branches. The 6 jars glistened in the fading light, beads of moisture gathering on the glass as if they breathed. He avoided their gaze and followed the narrow trail to the water. The surface was mirror still, perfectly smooth except for a faint circle of disturbance near the center, like something slowly sinking or rising to the shoreline. He found what Claire had written about, a small, rusted metal hatch half buried beneath reeds and mud. The number 5 had been carved roughly into its surface. His heart thundered as he fit the brass key into the lock. It turned easily, as though it had been waiting for him. The hatch groaned open, releasing a wet gust of air that smelled like rot and iron. Beneath it, a narrow stairway descended into black water. Each step creaked like bone. Aaron shone his flashlight downward and saw, suspended below the surface, hundreds of jars, some clear, some dark, all drifting weightless. Each glowing faintly from within, he lowered himself into the cold, his breath catching. The water clutched at him, and with every movement, the jars shifted. Faces flickered within them. Men, women, children, all captured mid-expression, eyes wide in silent plea. Some faces were recent, others were old and distorted, their features eroded by time. And among them, he saw her, Claire. Her face was pale, her hair floating like dark smoke around her. Her eyes met his, and her mouth moved in slow, desperate words, "Don't look down." But he did. Beneath the layer of jars was a deeper darkness, something massive and breathing. From it rose a faint glow, like an ember at the bottom of the lake. Then a shape emerged, a long, pale hand breaking through the gloom, reaching upward. Another followed, gripping the edge of the stairwell. The figure that surfaced was the same one from the photographs, Elias Vane, or what remained of him. Water poured from his hollow sockets and open mouth as he stared up at Aaron. His voice came like a drowned whisper. "Now you see how stories end." Aaron stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. It sank into the water, and for a brief instant before the beam died, he saw hundreds of jars turning toward him, their faces shifting in unison. He scrambled up the stairs, the hatch slamming shut behind him without his touch. The lake's surface went calm again, leaving only the echo of Elias's voice drifting through the fog. 7. Aaron didn't remember how he got back to the cabin. The world was a blur of water, fog, and noise that felt too close to his skull. His clothes clung to his skin, cold and heavy. Every breath came shallow, every heartbeat too loud. He collapsed just inside the door, coughing up lake water that smelled of rust and rot. The jars on the porch rattled faintly in their places, as though greeting him. There were 7 now, perfectly aligned, their faint glow pulsing in rhythm with his breathing. He tried not to count them, but his eyes couldn't look away. The typewriter waited for him. It sat on the desk exactly where he'd left it, but the paper had changed again. Fresh words marched neatly across the page, printed in his own style, but not in his voice. The next story is ready to be told. He tore the paper free, hands shaking. "No," he whispered. "No more." But when he turned to throw it into the fire, the typewriter clacked again on its own, striking letter after letter, the sound fast and fevered. The new sentence formed slowly as if by invisible hands. "You looked too long. Now you belong." The mirror above the fireplace caught his reflection as he turned. He froze. The man staring back wasn't entirely him. The eyes were hollowed, the skin wet and gray as driftwood, and faint light flickered inside the pupils, like something trapped behind glass. He stumbled back, striking the table. The jars clinked, and the reflection in the mirror smiled, though he hadn't. One by one, the lids on the jars began to unscrew themselves. A thin mist coiled from each one, floating toward the ceiling before merging together into a dense, humming fog. Within it, voices whispered, thousands overlapping. He writes us. He keeps us. He keeps us. Aaron grabbed the nearest jar and hurled it against the wall. It shattered, but the water inside didn't spill. It hung in the air, suspended, forming a shape, a face. Claire's face. You can't destroy them, she whispered. He needs witnesses. Her features flickered, fading in and out like a projection through smoke. He collects the ones who try to tell. You shouldn't have read the notes. The lantern light bloomed outside again, brighter than ever. The air grew heavy, the floorboards trembling as the door creaked open on its own. Through the doorway stood Elias Vane, or what remained of him, dripping, bent, and silent. The jars on the table began to glow in unison, a heartbeat rhythm pulsing through the cabin. Elias stepped forward, leaving wet footprints that smoked faintly where they touched wood. His voice was quiet, almost kind. Every story needs an ending. When morning came, the cabin was empty again. The table was dry. The typewriter was clean. Only 7 jars sat on the railing, glinting in the pale dawn. Inside the 7th, faint and water-warped, was a Polaroid of Aaron sitting at the desk, smiling faintly, eyes blank. His reflection in the window showed the same hollow stare as all the others who'd come before him. By noon, the cabin's online listing had been updated once again, a quiet writer's retreat by Hollow Lake. Private, peaceful, perfect for creative solitude.